What if Walter White was born in Warhammer 40K? The sulfur came first, before anything else, before the hiss of the ventilation shafts, or the grinding communion prayer of the forge looms, or the distant liturgical percussion of the upper-tier magi processing in their blessed corridors. There was sulfur, thick and yellow-edged, coating the tongue and settling into the lungs like a permanent resident. Walter Weiss had breathed it for 19 years. He no longer noticed it the way a man notices air. He noticed it the way a man notices gravity, which is to say, he noticed it only when something reminded him that others were not subject to it in the same measure. The reminder, on this particular rotation, came in the form of a vox transmission from the upper spires. The voice of Magos Primaris Colhen Drast filled the lower forge's announcement grill with the resonant, half-mechanized timbre of a man who had been augmenting his larynx for 40 years. Drast was announcing, in that practiced cadence of institutional magnanimity, the successful completion of the BioStim Epsilon 12 catalogue and the formal acceptance of its findings by the Departamento Munitorum. He thanked his research cohort in language so precisely vague that no individual name survived the sentence intact. He thanked the Omnissiah for the gift of cognition. He thanked the Forge World's Administrative Council for their patience and continued funding. He did not thank Walther Weiss. Walther was standing at his workbench in sub-level 14, surrounded by the catalogued output of 11 years of biochemical labor. Vials of compound, sequenced protein chains in suspension, notebooks written in his precise, cramped hand, a hand that had never fully accepted augmetic assistance because the tactile transmission of data through meat and bone was something Walther had decided, at 23, was not a limitation but a methodology. Those notebooks contained the Epsilon 12 findings, all of them, the original derivations, the failed iterations he had quietly corrected without attribution, the 3 breakthrough formulations that had taken the research from stalled academic exercise to something the Munitorum was apparently willing to fund in perpetuity. The announcement ended. The forge looms resumed their grinding prayer. Walther set down the beaker he was holding with the careful, deliberate stillness of a man deciding something. He did not smash it. He did not shout. He turned back to his workbench and resumed cataloguing, and this, more than any rage, was the thing about Walther Weiss that should have warned someone. Drast had stolen from him twice before. The first time, Walther had filed a formal doctrinal complaint through the appropriate Mechanicus channels and received a response, 14 months later, informing him that matters of research primacy were determined by hierarchical certification grade and that his certification was insufficient to support his claim. The second time, he had said nothing at all and watched, and learned how Drast's machinery worked. This third time, he returned to his work. Because Walther Weiss had already been planning something else. He had been planning it, in the careful partitioned architecture of his mind, for 4 months. Not because he intended treason, not because he had decided, in some dramatic moment of revelation, to become something other than what he was. He had been planning it because the problem interested him, because the biochemical framework of imperial combat stimulants was, if he was being precise about it, crude to the point of embarrassment. Berserker compounds, adrenal suppressors, crude pain inhibitors that simply hammered a man's threat assessment centers into silence and called it enhancement. The Munitorum had been using variations of the same 6 formulae for 300 years. 300 years of stagnation because no one with the cognitive architecture to do better had also possessed the motivation. Walther Weiss now possessed both. The biohazard incident happened 6 weeks after Drast's announcement, and it happened because of institutional indifference. A containment canister in sub-level 9 flagged 3 times for integrity failure by servitor maintenance crews whose reports had been routed to a departmental queue that no living Magos was currently assigned to process, finally breached. The mutagenic compound inside, a discarded research byproduct from a chaos-adjacent xenobiology study that the upper tiers had archived without proper disposal, aerosolized into the ventilation system. Sub-level 14 caught the fringe of the exposure cloud. Most of the workers in the area wore standard rebreathers rated for chemical processing environments. Those rebreathers were sufficient. Walther's rebreather had a hairline fracture in the seal, filed for replacement 6 weeks prior, not yet replaced. He breathed in 3 seconds of compound-laced air before the internal atmosphere sensors triggered the emergency seal and the ventilation rerouted. 3 seconds. It was, the Medicae would later tell him, in language carefully engineered to communicate nothing, an unfortunate duration. The Mechanicus investigation concluded in 8 days. The report, classified at a tier Walther did not have access to, noted the containment failure, attributed it to standard infrastructural variance, and recommended incremental maintenance budget review. No disciplinary action was recorded. No formal report was submitted to the Biologist Oversight Council. The canister's origin documentation was quietly amended to list the compound as a lesser irritant, Category 3, non-mutagenic. The discharge package arrived at Walther's workbench via data slate, delivered by a junior scribe who did not make eye contact. 18 months, the Medicae had told him, not 18 months from the incident, from the moment he had sat in the Medicae's diagnostic chair and watched the augmetic reader translate his cellular decay into a clean numerical prognosis. 18 months from that day. That meant, accounting for the 3 weeks between the incident and his appointment, he had approximately 17 months and 1 week remaining as a living entity. The discharge package included the standard severance of his research rights. Everything he had produced under Mechanicus employment, every notebook, every vial, every formula catalogued or not catalogued, belonged to the institution. This was standard. This was always standard. Walther had known this the day he signed his induction covenant at 22 years old. He had signed it because the alternative was the forges as a servitor adjunct, a life of diminished cognition and maintenance labor. And Walther Weiss had known even at 22 that his mind was not a resource to be surrendered to that. Now his mind was to be surrendered to inevitable cellular dissolution, and the institution was helpfully taking everything else along with it. He read the data slate once, folded it, set it beside the beaker he had not smashed 6 weeks ago. Then he pulled out a fresh notebook, one he had purchased with his own credits from an underhive stationer, not Mechanicus issued, not subject to institutional ownership, and he began to write. He wrote for 11 hours without stopping. What emerged was not a formula, it was a framework, a theoretical architecture for a neurochemical compound, unlike anything in the Munitorum catalogue, unlike anything in the xenobiology studies he had spent years quietly accessing through channels Dras did not know he had, unlike anything, he suspected, that had been attempted in quite this way on any forge world in this sector. The compound he was conceptualizing did not suppress the threat assessment centers. It did not drown the pain regulatory systems in adrenal override. It did precisely the opposite. It clarified. It removed the biochemical noise between perception and cognition, the evolutionary static that filled human consciousness with fear and self-doubt, and the constant low-level performance of social identity, and left behind something clean, something very nearly perfect, a mind operating at its full theoretical capacity, aware of everything, afraid of nothing, not because fear had been chemically suppressed, but because the compound made the mathematics of every situation so crystalline, so comprehensible, that fear became simply unnecessary data. Walther Weiss knew this was possible because he had spent 19 years being approximately 70% of the way there without any chemical assistance. He needed a lab he did not control, and resources he did not have. He needed a partner. Pietra Voss was not difficult to find. On a forge world like Cruxis Tertia, where the underhive sprawled in sulfur-choked layers beneath the forge floor infrastructure, where enforcer patrols were chronically undermanned, and gang territories mapped to production zones the way parasites mapped to hosts, men like Pieter Voss were a predictable fixture. He had been, at one point, a genuinely skilled synthesist, working for a trafficking organization called the Copperjaw Cartel that had controlled stim distribution across 4 subsectors of the underhive. He had a gift for field chemistry, the kind developed not in Mechanicus laboratories with precisely calibrated equipment and the Omnissiah's blessing, but in corroded backrooms with improvised heating elements and recycled glassware. The Copperjaw cartel had been dismantled by enforcers 17 months prior. Pieter had served 4 months in a labor assignment. He was, at the moment Walther found him, employed as a waste processor in sub-level 11, doing work that cost him nothing intellectually and was slowly costing him everything else. Their first meeting took place in a maintenance alcove off a ventilation corridor on sub-level 12, which Walther had identified as structurally isolated from the nearest Vox pickup by approximately 40 meters of interfering pipe infrastructure. He brought no weapon and wore his Mechanicus workrobe, which he had not yet returned to stores. He sat down across from Pieter Voss and said, without preamble, what he wanted to build, what it would do, and what he was offering in exchange. Pieter Voss stared at him for a long time after the explanation concluded. "You're Mechanicus," Pieter said. "I was," Walther said. "You want to cook stims in the underhive. I want to cook a neurochemical precision compound in a controlled environment with adequate power access and ventilation. The underhive provides those things without institutional oversight." Pieter's jaw worked for a moment. "What do you get out of it? You're dying." This was, Walther had already concluded, the most irrelevant question anyone could ask. He answered it anyway, because Pieter needed to understand him well enough to work alongside him. "I get to finish something," he said. "Something that matters. Something no one else has done." He paused. "And I get not to spend 17 months waiting." The lab they built, over 4 weeks, in an abandoned coolant processing node off sub-level 7, was not beautiful. It was, in the technical sense that mattered to Walther, functional. Pieter contributed contacts in the salvage networks who could move equipment without documentation. Walther contributed the knowledge of which equipment actually mattered and how to improvise around the absence of what they could not obtain. They worked in 12-hour shifts. They argued daily, sometimes violently, in the way that two people of genuine capability argue when they are working in close proximity on something that demands precision, which is to say they argued about everything and resolved almost nothing through conversation, the resolution coming instead through iterative experiment and the cold weight of evidence. The first batch was inadequate. Walther knew before testing that it was inadequate. He tested it on himself anyway. The sensation was not what the notebooks had predicted it would feel like, because sensations never were. What the notebooks had predicted was a systematic reduction in cognitive noise. What Walther experienced, sitting on a salvaged crate in the coolant node lab with 1700 milligrams of the first impure synthesis moving through his bloodstream, was something he spent 40 minutes attempting to accurately describe in his non-Mechanicus notebook afterward. The closest he came was clarity purchased at the cost of warmth. Every surface in the lab was precisely what it was. Every shape, every distance, every contingency. His own body was data, correctly read. His 17 months were data, correctly weighted. The work in front of him was data, correctly prioritized. Nothing was obscured by the emotional weather that human cognition required in order to process the complexity of being alive. It was, he wrote, perhaps the finest 40 minutes of his existence. The second batch was better. The third batch was the beginning of something new. The Vermilion Lecter found them on the 47th day. She arrived at the lab not through the corridor Walther monitored, but through an access shaft from a lower level, which meant she had known about the lab for some time before she chose to appear. She was human form, slight, with the kind of stillness that distinguished the magus caste of gene-stealer cults from ordinary apostles. A stillness that was not the absence of movement, but the presence of something else moving behind it. Her eyes were wrong, in the way that eyes are wrong, when the biology that shapes them has been guided by something non-Terran. She wore the dress of a mid-tier Forge Master's administrative aide, precisely correct in every detail, the kind of precision that indicated a life spent performing normalcy to audiences who were watching. She said nothing for a full minute after stepping into the lab. She looked at the equipment. She looked at Walther. She looked at Pieter, who was holding a wrench in the particular way that a man holds a wrench when he is deciding whether it is a tool or a weapon. Then she said, "The Copperjaw product never did this. Nothing from the upper forges does this. What you are making is different in kind, not degree. Walther said, "You have been sampling the distribution." "Selectively," the lector said. "I have 37 initiates whose cognitive performance I track with some precision. The initiate who received your product 3 weeks ago, through the salvage worker chain, has not behaved like my other initiates. He has become more effective. He has also become more himself, which is unusual, because the processes of initiation tend to produce a particular kind of self in their subjects, and yours has produced a different kind." "What kind?" Walther asked. "Colder," she said. "More capable of holding a complex goal in mind across time without the emotional degradation that accompanies commitment. More capable of seeing other people as instruments and less capable of investing in their welfare unnecessarily." She paused. "These are qualities I value." Walther regarded her for a moment with the same precise attention he brought to specimen analysis. "You are not here to report us," he said. "I am here," the lector said, "to tell you that I know your name, Walther Weiss. I know what was taken from you. I know what the Magos Primaris signed his name to, that was yours. And I am here to tell you that what you are building deserves to exist at a scale commensurate with its quality, and that the Patriarch's congregation has resources, distribution infrastructure, and a genuine appreciation for capability that the Mechanicus, manifestly, does not." The silence in the coolant node held for a long moment. Pieter looked at Walther. Walther looked at the lector. "I want," Walther said carefully, "to be clear about what I am selling and what I am not. I am selling a product, not loyalty, not ideology, not the assistance of whatever your organization is planning beyond the walls of this conversation." The lector smiled with a face that had learned smiling from careful observation. "Of course," she said. This was, Walther understood, a lie, but it was a productive lie, and he was comfortable with productive lies. The expansion took 11 weeks. The lector provided 3 additional lab spaces in deeper underhive nodes, equipment that was newer and better sourced than anything Walther and Peter had managed through salvage contacts, and a distribution network that reached through the Forge world's grey markets with the practiced efficiency of something that had been functioning for years before Walther's contribution arrived to enhance it. Walther spent the expansion period doing what he did best, refining. The 4th, 5th, and 6th generation formulas were not iterations of the first so much as they were corrections of it. He understood, by the 6th generation, that the first batch had been like a man's first attempt at a precise mechanical drawing. The intention was there. The architecture was visible, but the execution was crude relative to what the mind had conceived. The 6th generation was not crude. Pieter, who tested it alongside Walther during the verification batch and said afterward only, "That is the most frightening thing I have ever felt," did not offer any technical objections. The product moved. In the parlance of the underhive distribution networks through which the lector's organization operated, things that moved were things that generated more things, and within 5 months of the partnership's formalization, the product had acquired a name, not a name Walther had chosen. A name the distribution chain had assembled from the descriptions of people who had experienced it. They called it Weissblut, which meant nothing to most of the people using it, but which the lector, when she told Walther, said with the particular inflection of someone bestowing a ceremonial title. "Your name," she said, "is on it." Walther looked at the lector's ceremonially sincere expression and did not say what he thought about the observation. What he thought was that a name on a street product was not the kind of recognition he had conceptualized during those 11 hours of notebook writing 6 months ago. What he felt, which was different from what he thought, and which he had learned to monitor precisely because feeling and thinking operated on different systems and the distinction mattered, was something that the compound he had synthesized would have reduced to silence. He had not taken a dose in 11 days. He had been monitoring the intervals carefully, because the cellular interaction between the compound and his existing mutagenic condition was a variable he had not yet fully characterized. He was dying. That had not changed. What had changed was the texture of the dying. The off-world distribution began as an accident. An Orc freebooter crew designated, in the Imperial Fleet intelligence records that Walther did not have access to but the Lecter did, as the Rusthead Consortium, had docked at Cruxis Tertia's orbital processing station to offload salvaged Void equipment and acquire supplementary materials. One of the Lecter's mid-tier operatives, a dock authority worker named Sene Varl, had included a case of the product in a payment arrangement for storage space, and the freebooters had taken it because they took everything that came as part of any transaction, on principle. 3 weeks later, the Rusthead Consortium had returned specifically for more. Orcs experiencing Weissblut did not, Walther was informed, experience clarification in any sense recognizable to the original design. What they experienced was a kind of furious competence that was distinct from their usual furious incompetence, a state in which their natural aggression became architectured, directed, precise. An Orc under Weissblut could, apparently, manage complex tactical problems with a facility that was unsettling to other Orcs, and deeply unsettling to anyone the Orc subsequently engaged in combat. The Rusthead Consortium's captain had reportedly thrown an entire case of competing product into a plasma reactor upon receiving the first shipment, calling the alternative product, in his idiom, just bashing, and calling Walther's compound, in the same idiom, bashing that knows where it's going. The rogue trader, a man named Casson Vell who operated between 3 systems with the cheerful moral flexibility characteristic of his profession, encountered the product through the same dock connections and recognized it as something the upper-tier markets would pay significantly more for than the underhive. He was right. He moved 40 units to an Aeldari Corsair vessel operating in the trailing debris field of the Cruxis system, and the Corsairs, who had purchased it as a curiosity and a provocation, called it in their own language something that translated approximately to the calculus, and returned for more. Aeldari experiencing Weissblut did not return unchanged, and neither did they return uninterested. Walther received a report on all of this from the Lecter's intelligence network, sitting in the original coolant node lab, which he had retained as his personal workspace even after the expansion, because it was where he thought most clearly. He read the report carefully. He set it down. He picked up his notebook. The field evolution was the first thing he wrote, because the field evolution was the problem. The product was not stable in the way a properly closed system is stable. It was stable in the way that a living organism is stable, which is to say, it was changing. The distribution chain had created conditions of use that the laboratory had not anticipated, because laboratories were controlled environments and the galaxy was not. Users were combining Weissblut with existing substances. Users with existing biochemical conditions were creating interaction profiles that altered the compound's behavior. The Genestealer Kist initiates of the Lecter's congregation, whose biology was not simply human, were experiencing the compound differently from baseline humans, and that difference was accumulating across their shared biochemical environment in ways that the Lecter was reporting with increasing frequency and decreasing interpretive confidence. The cult was mutating, not in the specific gene sequences that the Patriarch's Kist directed, which were proceeding as intended. It was mutating in behavior, in culture, in the particular shape of the cognitive world the congregation inhabited, and the mutation was following a direction that was not toward the hive mind's patient patience or the Patriarch's protective ferocity, but toward something colder and more structured and considerably more interested in using other living things as instruments. Walther recognized what he was looking at, because he had spent considerable effort understanding his own mind over the preceding 11 years, and the shape of the behavioral mutation in the Lecter's congregation was the shape of his own mind, scaled to a community of several thousand. He wrote this observation in the notebook with the same steady hand he used for everything, and did not stop writing for 3 hours. What he concluded, at the end of those 3 hours, was threefold. First, the compound's deepest effect was not enhancement but subtraction, and what it subtracted was the layer of cognition that maintained the fiction of other people's reality, the neurological substrate that made other minds feel real, rather than merely theoretically present. Second, this effect had been present in his original formulation, not as a side effect, but as a consequence of what the formulation was achieving, because clarity of this precision required treating the self as the only fully legible data point, and that was a logical architecture with consequences. Third, he had possessed this cognitive profile in its natural, unsynthesized form for approximately his entire adult life, and the compound had not taught it to the users who now exhibited it. It had revealed it. This was the most interesting thing Walther Weiss had concluded in a life full of interesting conclusions. He was still sitting with it when Magos Inquisitor Serova Dane made her first visible move. She did not announce herself as an Inquisitor, naturally. Her cover on Cruxis Tertia was as a visiting biologist assessor from a collegial body evaluating research output quality across 3 Forge worlds in the sector, which was the kind of cover that was perfectly mundane and completely plausible, and which Walther, who had not achieved what he had achieved by missing things that other people missed, identified as a construction within 2 hours of receiving the notification of her presence in the upper spires. The notification arrived through Mechanicus internal communications, which he still received because his formal discharge had not yet been processed, a bureaucratic delay that was, he had long since concluded, entirely typical. He identified her as Inquisition by 3 things. First, her travel documentation listed an institution that existed at the right level of specificity to be convincingly real, and at the wrong level of institutional detail to have actually produced it. Second, the questions she was filing with the upper-tier research council were precisely the questions that someone would ask if they were trying to establish a behavioral baseline for mid to lower Forge zone cognitive performance without appearing to investigate it specifically. Third, she had, in her first 6 hours on World, visited Sub-Level 11's Administrative Records Office, which was the least interesting location on Cruxis Tertia for a biologist assessor, and the most interesting location for anyone attempting to reconstruct the movement patterns of former Mechanicus personnel through non-biometric records. She was looking for him. She was looking, more precisely, for the product. She had found the product's behavioral signature first, in the cult initiate network, and she was following the cognitive anomalies backward toward their source with the methodical precision of a person who understood that the most valuable intelligence was almost never the obvious intelligence. She was, Walther concluded, reading the same data he was reading and arriving at conclusions through a different architecture. He respected this. He also understood that she would eventually arrive at the coolant node. He had approximately 6 weeks, he estimated, possibly 8 if she was being methodical about establishing false trails before the cult's network realized she was on World and began active counter-surveillance. He factored this into his timeline. The Lector, when informed, wanted to deploy 3 of her congregation's enforcement operatives against the Inquisitor immediately. Walther said no. This produced an exchange that was, in its quiet, the most direct confrontation he had yet had with the organization he had partnered with. The Lector sat across from him in a warehouse space in the mid-tier transit zone that she used for meetings, and she looked at him with her wrong eyes, and she said that the Inquisition's presence on World represented a categorical threat to everything the Patriarch's children had built here over 12 years of patient work. Walther said, "I understand that. I am telling you that killing an Inquisitor within the first month of her deployment is not containment. It is ignition. She has already filed reports that go somewhere automated. If those reports stop being updated, the bodies they trigger into motion are worse than the Inquisitor." "And your alternative?" the Lector said. "I have not finished my alternative," Walther said. "Give me 3 weeks." "You have 2, the Lector said. Walther returned to the coolant node and worked. What he was building in those 2 weeks was not a weapon and was not a solution. It was a complication. He understood Serova Dane well enough by this point, from the trail of her actions on World and from the record of Ordo Xenos methodological doctrine that the Lector's network had obtained, to understand that she was not a woman who could be simply deflected or simply accelerated. She was a woman of the same fundamental cognitive architecture as himself, systematic, patient, process-driven, capable of maintaining a complex goal in mind across time without the emotional noise that degraded most people's sustained attention. She would not be deterred by a dead end. She would be, he suspected, briefly fascinated by a sufficiently interesting problem. He needed to give her a more interesting problem. The product he manufactured over those 2 weeks was a variant, the 7th generation, built specifically for a use case he had not anticipated in the original framework. It was designed for a user with augmetic neural interfaces, which Inquisitors of Dane's tier almost certainly carried, and it was designed to produce not clarification, but the experience of clarification, the sensory profile of the compound's effect, without the compound's actual neurochemical mechanism, because the actual mechanism required specific receptor configurations that augmetic enhanced neurology interrupted at the binding stage. The experience would be genuine, the transformation would not be permanent, and it would take, he calculated, approximately 4 days for the Inquisitor's analytical faculties to complete the process of recognizing what had been done to her, during which time she would believe, with the full confidence of a mind that was very nearly as good as his, that she had understood something true. He arranged, through a chain of intermediaries that traced cleanly to a low-tier cult operative who could be burned without consequence, for the variant to reach Dane as a sample submitted by an anonymous informant claiming to be a disaffected gang chemist with knowledge of the distribution network. He had, to his own clinical interest, something that functioned like admiration for Serova Dane. She was doing what he would have done in her position. She was doing it well. The admiration was genuine, and the action he was taking against her was genuine, and there was no contradiction between these two things that Walther could identify, which was in itself a data point he catalogued carefully. The variant reached her on a 7th day. By 10th day, the Lecter's surveillance network reported that the Inquisitor had redirected her primary investigative focus toward a chaos-adjacent chemical distribution ring operating in the upper mid-tier transit zone, a ring that was entirely real and had nothing to do with Walther's operation, and which had been the obvious alternative suspect for anyone reading the behavioral anomalies in a certain way. She had reached the wrong conclusion with precision and confidence and the full weight of a very good mind. Walther noted this in his notebook. He also noted that he had perhaps given himself 4 weeks before she corrected, and possibly less. Pieter found him in the coolant node the morning after the variant's confirmed effect, and Pieter stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Walther with the expression that Pieter had been using with increasing frequency over the preceding months. The expression of a man watching something he had agreed to stand next to that has become considerably larger than the thing he agreed to stand next to. You used the product on an Inquisitor, Pieter said. A variant, Walther said. That's worse, Pieter said. It is more complicated, Walther said. Pieter was quiet for a moment. When does this end? He said. When does there come a point where you say the thing is built, the thing is done, we take whatever we have and we go? Walther looked at Pieter with the careful attention he gave to everything, which was not the attention of a man who found Pieter's question trivial. It was the attention of a man who found the question precisely as significant as it was. Pieter had asked it before, in different forms. Pieter would ask it again. The answer was always the same, and Walther had learned to state it simply rather than argue it, because the argument was one that Pieter's emotional architecture could not follow to its conclusion. There is no version of this, Walther said, where we have enough. That isn't what this is. Pieter looked at him for a long time, then he went to his station and began prep work for the morning's synthesis run, without another word. This was also a data point. The Orc situation escalated 6 days later. The Rusthead Consortium had, apparently, shared a shipment with a second freebooter crew, whose captain had not responded to Weissblut with the Rusthead captain's structured enthusiasm, but with the standard Orc response to something effective being possessed by someone else, which was to want to take it. A minor void engagement had occurred in the orbital processing station's approach corridor. It had attracted the attention of 2 Imperial Navy patrol frigates that were now demanding a docking inspection, which was creating pressure across the orbital station's operations and, by extension, pressure on the dock authority workers who formed a significant tier of the Lecter's surface-based distribution infrastructure. The Lecter arrived at the coolant node in person, which she had done only once before, and she arrived without the advance notice she usually provided, which meant she was operating under time pressure she was not certain she controlled. She stood in the lab's doorway, and Walther, who had been running a diagnostic on the 7th-generation formulation, turned to face her with the beaker still in his hand. "The Navy's interest will bring Ministorum personnel alongside the dock inspection," she said. "There are 2 Sisters of Battle assigned to the station's Shrine Compliance Office. If they join the inspection team, the lower-tier distribution contacts are exposed." Walther considered this. "How much of the distribution infrastructure is docked toward?" 60% of the surface outbound transit. Then reroute the remaining 40% to the alternate transfer points in the mid-level processing zones while the inspection runs. Suspend all station-adjacent movement for the duration. The inspection will take 4 days. 4 days of suspension reduces the supply chain to a fraction of current output. "Yes," Walther said. "That is unacceptable to the Patriarch's needs," the Lecter said. Walther set the beaker down. He looked at the Lecter directly, which he did not always do, because direct engagement was a resource he allocated carefully. "The Patriarch's needs," he said, "are not my operational constraint. The product's survival is my operational constraint. The product survives by not being found. If it is found because you pushed supply through a compromised route, it does not exist at any production level." The Lecter's stillness deepened, which was a thing her stillness did when whatever was behind it was fully present. "You speak of the Patriarch's congregation as if it is a client." "It is," Walther said. "It is your protection," the Lecter said. "Your distribution, your continued existence on this world. And I provide," Walther said, "a product that is worth more to you than any of those things cost me. This is not a relationship of charity in either direction. If you tell me the Patriarch's needs supersede operational logic, then we are having a different conversation, and the outcome of that conversation is not one that benefits either of us." The Lecter studied him. Behind her wrong eyes, something was working through something. It was not anger. It was, he thought, the thing that happened when an entity that was accustomed to commanding recognized a mind that could not be commanded by the tools it had available. 4 days, she said. 4 days, Walther confirmed. She left. The lab was quiet. Pieter had been listening from his station without appearing to listen, and now he exhaled slowly through his nose. "She's going to have you killed," Pieter said quietly. "Not yet," Walther said. He picked up the beaker again. "She doesn't have a replacement." What Walther did not tell Pieter, because there was no practical benefit in telling him, was that he had spent 3 weeks preparing for the moment the Lecter decided that a replacement was more achievable than continued negotiation with someone she could not control. The preparation was chemical. It was the 8th generation. It was targeted specifically at the gene-stealer-kissed biological profile, and it was in a separately secured storage unit in the sub-level access tunnels that the Lecter's network did not know existed, and it was not a product. It was a correction mechanism. He hoped not to use it. He intended to be prepared to. Sirova Dane corrected her conclusion on the 26th day after receiving the variant. Walther knew because the Lecter's surveillance network tracked her physical movement, and on the 26th day she returned to the sub-level 11 administrative records office that had been her first stop, and she was there for 6 hours, and when she left, she was moving with the specific purposeful efficiency of a person who had been deceived and was now rerunning the problem from a point 2 steps further back than where she had started. She was, he estimated, now approximately 2 weeks from the coolant node. Not because she was slower than he had calculated, but because she was more careful. She was approaching the problem the way he would approach a compound with unknown stability, methodically, with full awareness that the explosion, if it came, would come from the thing you were most certain you understood. He began the 9th generation that evening. The 9th generation was different. He did not work backward from an objective the way he had worked on every previous iteration. He worked from a question. which was, what is the actual terminal form of this compound if optimized purely for what it has always been trying to do? Not what the Munitorum wanted. Not what the Lector wanted. Not what the Orc captain wanted. What the chemistry itself was moving toward, if he removed every external constraint from the formulation and simply followed the internal logic of the molecular architecture to its natural conclusion. He worked for 3 days without sleeping more than 4 hours across the 3. Pieter brought food and coffee substitute and did not ask questions. The 9th generation emerged on the morning of the 4th day, and Walther looked at it in its flask and understood, with the quality of understanding that has no need of verification, that he had done what he had set out to do 8 months ago in the first 11 hours of notebook writing. This was the thing, not a thing. The thing. The complete form of what his mind had been moving toward since the moment he had understood that the Munitorum's catalogue was an embarrassment and that no one else was positioned to correct it. He tested it himself. 50 milligrams, which was half the effective dose of the previous generations, because he did not know yet what the ceiling was, and he had learned enough to approach unknown ceilings with a margin. He sat in the coolant node lab for 2 hours and experienced what the 9th generation did. Afterward, he sat in the lab for another hour without moving, and then he wrote in the notebook for a very long time. What he wrote was not a technical description, it was a moral inventory, which was unusual because Walther Weiss did not typically conduct moral inventories. He conducted them in the same way he conducted all his other analyses, without sentiment, without the narrative architecture that most people use to make their own histories legible to themselves. He simply listed what was true, in the order it became relevant. He had begun this because he was dying. True. He had begun this because he had been wronged. True, and operationally irrelevant at the current stage. He had built something of genuine and unprecedented quality. True. In building it, he had assisted a Xenos cult in accelerating its cognitive conditioning of several thousand human initiates. True. The initiates were becoming more like him. True, and the thing that sat in the base of the listing like a weight. He had manipulated an inquisitor of the Emperor's Holy Ordos with a compound specifically engineered to subvert her analytical faculties. True. He had done all of these things not because the dying made them necessary, not because the wronging made them justified, but because he was, when given the correct environment and sufficient motivation, exactly the kind of person who did these things. The compound had not made him this. The Mechanicus's institutional cruelty had not made him this. The mutagenic exposure and the discharge package and the sulfur-choked lower forges had not made him this. He had been this, he wrote, in precisely the same way that a compound is what it is before it is synthesized. The elements were always present. The environment had simply provided the conditions under which they could combine. He closed the notebook. He looked at the 9th generation flask. He began calculating how to ensure it survived the events of the next 4 weeks. Sirova Dane moved on the 31st day. She did not move on the coolant node. She moved on the Lector. It was a clean operation, the kind that an inquisitor executes when she has spent long enough building a net to know where its edges are. She deployed 8 inquisitorial agents in coordinated simultaneous entry across 3 of the expanded lab spaces, using guard squad support from the Forge World's garrison in a framing that made the raid appear to be a standard chemical distribution enforcement action rather than an Ordo Xenos priority response. She burned 2 of the Lector's mid-tier operatives for intelligence before the entry. She timed the operation to a shift change in the Lector's internal security rotation. She came very close. What she did not know, and what Walther had spent 3 weeks ensuring she would not know, was that the expanded lab spaces she had correctly identified held no product and held no formula. They held equipment and held the specific chemical arrangements of an active laboratory, because a laboratory with no product was a laboratory that someone was about to use, rather than a laboratory someone had just abandoned. The agents found the apparatus of sophisticated chemistry, and found the absence of the chemistry's output, and found, in 2 of the spaces, data slates loaded with documentation that pointed toward upper-tier research council activities in a way that was sufficiently plausible, given the context of Walther's documented professional history, to require investigation before it could be dismissed. Dane, Walther understood from the surveillance network's report the following morning, was now operating under the knowledge that she had been deflected twice and that the mind she was pursuing was not a gang chemist who had gotten lucky with a formula, but something considerably more careful. He respected this. He was also running out of time. The Lecter had survived the raid. 3 of her enforcement operatives had not. She arrived at the coolant node, through the access shaft, within 12 hours of the raid's conclusion, and she did not sit down. "You knew this was coming," she said. "I knew something was coming," Walther said. The specifics were uncertain. "The lab spaces were emptied 3 days ago," the Lecter said, "before I knew the Inquisitor had corrected. You moved the product before I knew to move it." "Yes," Walther said. The Lecter looked at him for a long moment. In her wrong eyes, the thing behind her stillness was fully present and fully engaged, and it was the first time Walther had seen it operate at full visibility, and it was, he noted clinically, not human. It was a patience of a different order, older and less interested in the specifics of any individual exchange, because it was the patience of something that was part of a larger network of minds, and whose individual mind was only one expression of a goal that would continue regardless of this conversation's outcome. "You do not serve us," the Lecter said. "You serve the product." "Yes," Walther said. "Then you must understand," she said, "that the Patriarch's children cannot afford a chemist who serves only himself. The Inquisitor is now aware of what we are producing. The Patriarch's design for this world cannot survive inquisitorial scrutiny at the operational level we currently require. We need the product discontinued, and the knowledge of it contained." Walther had been expecting this. "Discontinued means me," he said. "It means the product," the Lecter said, "and the record of it, and the individuals who carry that record." Walther looked at the Lecter for a full 5 seconds, which was a long time for him to spend looking at anything when he already understood it. "You want to kill me," he said, "and take the formula." "We want to contain the exposure," the Lecter said. "The formula, if it can be recovered from your documentation, would remain within the congregation's use, narrowed, controlled, not distributed in ways that draw inquisitorial attention." "You cannot replicate it without me," Walther said. "Perhaps," the Lecter said. "We have other resources." "You do not," Walther said, and the certainty in his voice was not performance. It was the certainty of a man who had spent 18 months ensuring that no one else possessed the cognitive prerequisites for what he had built. Pieter could not replicate the 9th generation. The Lecter's congregation chemists could not replicate it. The Mechanicus could not replicate it if they were handed his notebooks, because the notebooks documented results, and the architecture of the mind that produced those results did not transfer with documentation. He was the product, and the product was still in him. He reached for the correction mechanism. He had placed it within arm's reach 3 weeks ago, in the false bottom compartment of the supply crate beside his primary workbench, because 3 weeks ago he had concluded that this conversation was likely. It was a delivery mechanism loaded with the 8th generation variant built for gene-stealer-kissed biology, aerosol dispersal, 6-meter radius, immediate onset. It would not kill. It would do something the Lecter would find considerably worse. It would, for approximately 18 hours, sever the neurological bridge between her individual cognition and the Patriarch's pheromone network, leaving her operating as an isolated, unmoored human mind, stripped of the orientation that the Xenos inheritance provided, fully exposed to every consequence and fear that the network normally distributed across its membership. He had never used it. He knew it would work the way he knew all his formulations would work before he synthesized them, which was with the certainty of a mind that had made the same calculation from first principles 12 different times, and arrived at the same answer each time. He looked at the Lecter. He looked at the mechanism. He did not reach for it. Not yet. "I want you to consider," he said, "what you are proposing to lose." The Lecter waited. "The 9th generation," Walther said, "is in a location that neither you nor the Inquisitor, can access without my assistance. It is the most precise neurochemical compound produced on this world in the last 300 years. It has applications I have not yet explored. It has a distribution reach that is now off-world, which means its existence as a commercial and influence-based asset extends beyond this world's politics. Killing me recovers none of this. It removes the mind that made it and leaves you with documentation you cannot use, a product you cannot replicate, and a formula that will degrade into incoherence within a generation of untrained handling. And if we let you live, the lector said. Then I continue to build what I am building, Walther said, and what I am building is worth more to your patriarch's long-term design than the short-term security of eliminating one more variable. The lector was still. The thing behind her eyes was working. He could not read it, because it was not working in any framework he had access to. It was working in the hive mind's patient arithmetic, in a calculus of conquest that operated on scales of years and populations that were beyond the individual meeting's resolution. You have 14 days, she said. If the Inquisitor reaches the coolant node before that period concludes, the agreement becomes void. She left through the access shaft. Walther sat down. He was shaking slightly, which he noted and catalogued without judgment, because it was information about the limits of what his body was currently managing. He picked up the notebook. He wrote 14 days. He began working. What he built in those 14 days was not the 10th generation, though the 10th generation was also built within the first 7. What he built was the architecture of his own disappearance, not death. Walther Weiss had spent 18 months refusing to die unremembered, and he was not going to permit that refusal to be voided by institutional convenience, whether the institution was the Mechanicus or a gene-stealer cult. He built, with the same systematic patience he brought to everything, a chain of contingencies. The 9th generation's primary stock, 12 complete units in sealed stasis containment, was moved to a location accessible only through a route he had documented in a cipher he had devised specifically for this purpose, a cipher based on his own cognitive architecture in a way that made it readable only to a mind structured like his own, which was to say, readable only to him, or, theoretically, to someone who had been using the product long enough to have their cognition reshaped toward his architecture, which was a population of one person whose location and identity he had not confirmed. The notebooks, both the technical documentation and the non-technical ones, were copied in compressed form to a data chip sealed against standard intrusion by 3 overlapping encoding methods, one of which was Mechanicus standard and 2 of which were not. Pieter was given a choice. Walther did not frame it as a choice dramatically. He sat across from Pieter in the coolant node on the 8th day and said what the options were with the same precision he applied to everything. Pieter could take the documentation of the first 8 generations, leave Cruxis Tertia through the rogue trader's contact network that Walther had already arranged access to, and begin building something in a different system with a head start that most synthesists would spend a career trying to earn. Or Pieter could stay, and the probability of his survival declined sharply with the probability that the Inquisitor arrived before the 14th day. Pieter looked at him for a long time. Pieter had been looking at him for long times with increasing frequency, and each long time had the quality of a man assembling evidence toward a conclusion he had already reached and was reluctant to finalize. "Did you ever care," Pieter said, "about any of it? The original plan, when you said you wanted to do something that mattered, was that real?" Walther considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said, "it was entirely real." And now, Walther looked at the flask of the 9th generation, secured in its stasis housing on the far bench. "What I said then was real," he said. "What is real now is different. What is real now is the work itself. The thing that exists because of what I built. That is the thing that matters. The reasons I began with have been superseded by the thing the reasons produced." Pieter was quiet for a moment. "That's not what matters means," he said. "To you," Walther said. Pieter left on the 10th day. He took the first through 8th generation documentation and the rogue trader contact, and he did not look back through the access hatch, and Walther did not watch him go for more than the moment required to confirm he had gone. He turned back to the bench. He was, for the first time in 8 months, alone in the lab. He worked. Sirova Dane arrived on the 12th day. She arrived not through the access hatch and not through the corridor, but through the ventilation shaft in the ceiling, which she had identified from the structural analysis of the coolant node's original installation blueprints, and she arrived with 2 inquisitorial agents in void-capable light armor, and a weapon that Walther recognized as modified for non-lethal incapacitation, which told him she wanted him functional, and told him that she had, at some point in the preceding days, concluded that the mind behind the product was more valuable than its mere cessation. This was, he decided, the most interesting thing she had done. She dropped from the shaft to the lab floor, and the 2 agents covered the exits, and she looked at him across the workbench with eyes that were entirely, correctly human, and they were the eyes of a person who had been outmaneuvered twice, and was looking at the thing that had done it, and finding it considerably smaller than the footprint it had left. "Walther Weiss," she said. "Magos Inquisitor," he said. He had confirmed her rank from 3 separate data points in the preceding 2 weeks. She moved toward the bench in the careful, deliberate way of someone moving through a space they have assessed for threats and not finished assessing. She looked at the 9th generation flask in its stasis housing. She looked at the workbench. She looked at him. "You used a neuro variant on me," she said. "Not a question. Not an accusation in the sense that accusations require indignation, an acknowledgement." "Yes," he said. "It was very precisely calibrated to my augmetic interface," she said. "Yes," he said. "Which means you knew what augmentics I carry before you built it," she said. "Inquisitors of your tier and ordo affiliation have a standard augmetic profile with a 20% variance. I built for the profile and corrected for the variance based on your movement patterns in the first 6 days of your investigation. Your left side motor response indicated a specific neuromotor augmetic type that narrows the profile considerably." Dane was quiet for a moment. "You watched me move," she said, "and derived my augmetic specifications from my gait." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, in the way that Pieter had looked at him with increasing frequency, which was with the expression of a person assembling evidence toward a conclusion they had already reached. But her conclusion was different from Pieter's. Pieter had been assembling evidence toward sorrow. Dane was assembling evidence towards something colder and more structured. "The cult has been corrupted by your product," she said. "The behavioral signature in the kist initiates no longer matches hive mind conditioning profiles. It matches something else." "Yes," Walther said. "Something that has your fingerprints," she said, cognitively. "The compound does what it was designed to do," Walther said. "The hive mind's conditioning and the compound's clarifying effect produce an interaction profile that the hive mind did not anticipate. Because the hive mind has never encountered anyone who thought like you," she said. He looked at her. He said nothing. "How long have you had left?" she said. Not clinically, not warmly, directly. 11 weeks, he said, by the original prognosis. The mutagenic progression has been modified by the compound's interaction with my existing condition. The timeline is less certain than it was. Modified how? Walther looked at the 9th generation flask. The compound interfaces with the mutagenic expression in ways I did not design and have not fully characterized, he said. It appears to be slowing the cellular degeneration. The mechanism is not clear to me, which is, as you might appreciate, an unusual experience. Dane looked at him with the full weight of her analytical faculty. The compound you synthesized to clarify human cognition, she said slowly, is interacting with the mutagenic compound that was supposed to kill you. Yes, Walther said. And you don't know what it's doing. I have hypotheses, Walther said. But you don't know. A pause. No. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I'm not going to arrest you today. I know, Walther said. You would have used the lethal weapons if you were going to arrest me. The non-lethal configuration indicates you want me functional, and you want me under your control, not under detention. Detention removes my capacity to work, which removes the product's future development from your access, which is not what the Ordo Xenos wants when it is looking at a compound that can corrupt gene-stealer cult conditioning. Dane did not confirm this. She did not deny it. She looked at the 9th-generation flask, and she looked at him, and what was behind her eyes was the particular combination of repugnance and professional recognition that the Inquisition experienced when it found a mind useful enough to be worth managing, rather than simply eliminating. "The cult will move against you within 2 days, she said. The Lector knows I'm here. She knows the arrangement is voided. She knows you are worth more to us alive than to her." Walther had known this since the access shaft opened. What he proposed was not alliance, because Walther Weiss did not form alliances. He proposed a working arrangement of defined scope and defined duration. He would provide the Ordo Xenos with access to the 9th-generation specifications and with his own continued labor on its development. The Ordo Xenos would provide him with a lab environment, supply chain access, and what he described as operational continuity. He did not use the word protection, because the word implied that his primary concern was his own survival, and his primary concern was the work, and his survival was simply a prerequisite of the work's continuation. Dane listened. She did not agree. "This is not how the Inquisition operates," she said. "I know," Walther said, "but it is how I operate, and the product does not exist without how I operate, and you have already determined the product is worth preserving." "You would be operating under inquisitorial sanction," she said, "with all the constraints that implies." "I would be operating in an inquisitorial lab," Walther said, "which contains the same elements as this lab, and a significantly larger power budget." Dane looked at him for the third long time in their conversation, and this time the conclusion she reached was visible, not because her face changed, but because the angle of her attention changed, the way a person's attention angle changes when they have finished weighing and begun deciding. "The cult will be purged from Cruxis Tertia," she said. "Completely." "Yes," Walther said. "The distribution chain will be dismantled." "The existing chain," Walther said. "Yes." She heard the distinction. She let it stand, which was its own kind of answer. The Lector's enforcement operatives arrived 40 minutes later. 3 of them came through the access hatch simultaneously, which was the maximum the hatch permitted, and they came with weapons that were not the cult's standard non-lethal enforcement options, but with tools designed for permanent resolution, which meant the Lector had concluded the arrangement was void and had dispatched people authorized to perform that void's practical expression. They were Gene Stealer kissed, which gave them strength and speed beyond baseline human performance, and they had operated in the Forge World's underhive long enough to know how to move in confined industrial spaces. Dane's 2 agents met them. What followed was, in the physical accounting of it, brief. The 2 inquisitorial agents were not Astartes and were not Psychers and did not carry weapons that functioned at mythic scale, but they were trained to a standard that the Mechanicus's institutional culture had never bothered to apply to the question of how to place a body in a specific location relative to a threat within the first 4 seconds of an engagement, and they applied that standard with the complete dispassion of people for whom this was a professional exercise. The first of the Lector's operatives fell to a void weapon discharge in the hatch opening before he fully cleared it, a contained blast that left him against the wall in a condition that removed him from the accounting permanently. The second cleared the hatch and made it 3 meters into the lab before one of Dane's agents placed a knee strike against the altered joint structure of her hip with enough calculated precision to fold her into the floor, followed by a weapon discharge at contact range. The third pulled back into the access shaft. Walther had not moved from his position beside the workbench during the preceding 11 seconds. He had watched with the clinical attention he gave to any process he was observing, noting the spatial logic of the engagement, the environmental constraint of the hatch dimension, the agent's movement economy. The third operative did not retreat far. Walther heard the sounds of a second engagement in the shaft. shorter and more definitive. Dane holstered her weapon. She looked at the lab. She looked at the 9th generation flask. "Pack what is irreplaceable," she said. "We have approximately 20 minutes before the Lecter escalates her response tier." Walther took 3 things: the notebook with the non-technical moral inventory, the data chip with the compressed formula archive, and the 9th generation flask in its stasis housing. Everything else in the coolant node, the equipment, the earlier formulations, the history of 8 months of work, he left without ceremony. It was replaceable. The work was not. The Lecter herself came as they were moving through the mid-level transit corridors, with 8 of her congregation's enforcement tier and the full weight of whatever the Patriarch's kiss had given her in the way of physical capacity, and she came with the particular wrongness of her eyes fully visible, and the stillness of her deepest self fully expressed, and she was the most dangerous thing Walther had personally encountered in his 18 months on the far side of the Mechanicus's institutional indifference. Dane's agents engaged the enforcement tier. The Lecter came for Walther. She was fast in the way that things shaped by Xenos inheritance are fast, which is to say, she was fast in a way that human muscle architecture should not permit, and she covered the 15 meters between them in less than 2 seconds, and Walther, who had been holding the correction mechanism since they entered the corridor, activated it at 8 meters. The aerosol reached her at 6. She stopped. Not physically stopped, because the 8th generation mechanism was not a paralytic. She stopped the way a person stops when the framework of meaning that organizes all their physical action is suddenly withdrawn. She stood in the transit corridor with the enforcement engagement happening behind her, and the Lecter's congregation agents falling to Dane's operatives 1 and 2 at a time, and she stood with her wrong eyes for the first time looking wrong in a different way. Looking wrong not because they held something more than human behind them, but because they held nothing behind them, the network severed, the pheromone bridge cut, the hive mind's patient ancient embrace removed for 18 hours that were going to be, Walther had calculated, the most disorienting 18 hours of her existence. He walked past her. She did not reach for him. He did not look back. The purge of the Vermilion Lecter's congregation took 11 days, conducted by the guard garrison, under Dane's operational authority, with the efficiency of a sledgehammer applied to a structure that had already been comprehensively mapped. The Patriarch himself was located in a sub-level sanctuary below the main cult operations zone and engaged with the full weight of Dane's personal authority and the equipment she had kept off-world as reserve capacity, and the engagement was, from what the intelligence reports described, significant and conclusive. The Lecter survived the purge. Her congregation did not. She was taken under inquisitorial custody for interrogation, and what the interrogation eventually produced was a detailed map of the cult's off-world contact network, which the Ordo Xenos found considerably valuable. Walther did not follow the purge's progress in any detail. He was in the new lab, which was aboard Dane's inquisitorial frigate in high orbit, and the lab was better than anything he had worked in before, and the work was already moving. He was, the Medicae who reviewed his case aboard the frigate confirmed, dying less quickly than projected. The interaction between the 9th generation and the mutagenic compound was doing something that the frigate's analytical systems were not fully equipped to characterize, and which required, the Medicae informed him, with the professional equanimity of someone who had seen stranger things, further monitoring. The mutagenic compound itself appeared to be, in some cellular interactions, stabilizing. This was not a recovery. It was not a remission. It was, the Medicae said, a negotiation. Walther looked at the Medicae's report. He set it aside. He picked up a new notebook, clean, with blank pages. He began writing. Dane found him there 6 hours later, sitting in the new lab with the 10th generation's framework already 3 pages into detailed notation. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him with the comprehensive attention of a person who had spent a career being surprised by nothing and who was currently managing something that had not been covered by that career's training. The Rusthead Consortium has distributed the 7th generation variant to at least 3 separate buyer pools in 2 systems, she said. I know, Walther said. The Aeldari Corsairs have reportedly synthesized an approximation from the samples they received, she said. It is not accurate, but it is close enough to produce partial effects. Their organic chemistry is better than they think it is, Walther said. Their approximation will degrade after the third generation of production. They will come back to the primary source. The primary source, Dane said, is currently aboard an inquisitorial frigate. Yes, Walther said. Dane looked at him. She looked at the notebook. She had been attempting, for several days, to determine whether what she was managing was an asset or something for which the category of asset was an insufficient frame. She had not finished determining this. What happens, she said, when you are no longer dying? Walther looked up from the notebook. He looked at her for a moment, the same quality of attention he had brought to the lector's wrong eyes, to Pieter's sorrowing long times, to every specimen he had ever analyzed. That, he said, is a question worth answering. He returned to the notebook. The frigate moved through the void above Cruxis Tertia, carrying its cargo of one human mind in a sulfur-stained workrobe, working at a bench in a lab that was better than any he had ever had, with 17 months on his prognosis, receding into something less certain and more complex, and the 10th generation taking shape in precise handwriting on clean white pages. Below him, the Forge World's lower spires breathed their yellow air and processed their ancient liturgies and filed their maintenance reports into queues that no living Magos would read in time. In the upper spires, Colhen Drast received a notification that his former research associate's Mechanicus employment file had been flagged for archival review by an inquisitorial authority. The notification used language that was carefully vague about why. Drast spent 11 minutes attempting to contact the relevant administrative office before concluding that the contact was generating a record he did not want to exist, and he stopped. He sat in his decorated rooms in the upper spires and he was, in the careful accounting of it, afraid. He did not know precisely what Walther Weiss had become in the year since the discharge packet had been delivered. He knew only that an Inquisitor had been on world looking for something connected to that name, and that the Inquisitor had left without being satisfied, which meant she was looking elsewhere. He knew that the formula his research council had attempted, after recovering the abandoned lab equipment, to reverse engineer from the residual chemical signatures, had produced nothing useful in 4 weeks of effort. He knew that his name was on work that was not his, and that the work had been superseded by something he had not anticipated, produced by a mind he had never taken seriously enough to fear. He sat in his decorated rooms and he was afraid, and this was the most accurate thing that had happened on Cruxis Tertia in years. Aboard the frigate, Walther wrote, the 10th generation was not a compound, it was a system. The compound was one element of it. But the broader system was the question of what a mind became when it operated for long enough at the capacity the compound enabled, and whether that was a direction or a destination, and whether the destination was something that could be mapped before it was reached. He was, he wrote, the most qualified person to investigate this question because he was the only person who possessed both the technical expertise to design the investigation and the first-hand experience of being the test case. He was also, he noted, the only person who had been approaching this destination long before the compound existed. He had not built the thing that made people like him. He had built the thing that let the galaxy see that they already were. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war and the grinding indifference of institutions older than memory, a single human mind had found its correct environment at last. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not a pulpit or a spire, a laboratory. A blank page, a question that had no answer yet. Walther Weiss, who had been born dying in the slow institutional sense, and who was now dying, and then perhaps not dying in a more interesting sense, had become the most dangerous thing the 41st millennium knew how to produce. Not a warrior, not a prophet, not a saint. A man who understood what he was, who had removed every comfortable lie between himself and that understanding, and who had 17 months, or 11 weeks, or an unknown duration, shaped like a negotiation, in which to work. The Omnissiah, the God Emperor, the hive mind, and the oldest intelligence of the Eldari had no category for him. He was not in their accounting. He did not require their accounting. He required only the bench, the flask, the page, and the next question. And in the cold, silent void above a sulphur world that had made him and then discarded him, Walther Weiss, who had always been this, who had always known what he was, sat down to work on something the galaxy had never quite seen before, and the notebook filled, and the stars moved, and somewhere in the distant administrative halls of the Ordo Xenos, a new file was opened in his name, flagged with a classification level that had no standard color and no standard protocol, labeled only with the single word that every institution eventually used for the thing it could not contain: asset.